Some lives don't run from danger. They walk straight through the storm to find the one person meant to save them. The snow fell in heavy sheets that night, thick enough to swallow the road whole, each flake carried sideways by a wind that howled like it remembered something old and unfinished. Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel of his aging pickup, the tires crunching slowly over a frozen highway that hadn't seen another car in miles, his breath fogging the inside of the windshield as the heater struggled to keep up with the bitter cold. At 40, Ethan had learned to read silence the way other men read maps, and this kind of silence, the kind that pressed against your chest and made the world feel too still, never came without reason. He was halfway between the last gas station and a town barely big enough to name when something shifted in the white blur ahead, not fast, not sudden, but deliberate, like it wanted to be seen. His foot eased off the gas. The headlights cut through the storm just enough to reveal a shape in the road, low to the ground, moving with a slow, uneven rhythm. Not a deer, not a coyote. As he rolled closer, the shape lifted its head, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. A German shepherd stood there, her coat dulled by ice, her body thin, her belly heavy with life she was still trying to protect, a length of chain dragging behind her like a shadow that refused to let go. Ethan's truck came to a stop with a soft crunch. The engine idled, low and steady, but the world outside felt suspended, as if even the storm had paused to watch what would happen next. The dog didn't run. She didn't bark. She simply looked at him, her amber eyes steady, searching, as though she had been walking through miles of cold and wind for one reason alone, to find this exact moment. Ethan opened the door, the wind slamming into him instantly, sharp and unforgiving, biting through his jacket as his boots sank into the powder. "Hey, easy," he called out, his voice softer than he expected, almost swallowed by the storm. The dog took a step back, not in fear, but in invitation, then turned slowly toward the dark line of trees beyond the road. Ethan hesitated for half a second, just long enough for an old memory to surface, the kind that came without warning, the kind that carried the weight of a moment when he had once arrived too late. 3 minutes too late. He shut the door behind him and followed. Each step into the forest felt heavier than the last, the snow deeper, the air colder, the silence thicker, until the road disappeared completely behind him, and all that remained was the sound of his own breath and the faint drag of metal against ice. The dog moved ahead, limping but determined, glancing back just enough to make sure he was still there, as if losing him now would mean losing something far greater than herself. Then she slowed. Then she stumbled. And when she finally stopped beneath a cluster of frozen pines, her legs trembled in a way Ethan recognized instantly, not from weakness, but from something far more urgent. He dropped to one knee, the cold biting through his jeans as he reached out carefully, his hand hovering for just a second before touching her side. She didn't pull away. She leaned into it. And in that quiet, breath-held moment, Ethan understood something without needing words. She hadn't just found him. She had chosen him. The wind pressed harder through the trees, carrying a low, hollow sound that seemed to echo beneath the snow, as if the ground itself was holding its breath, and Ethan felt it settle deep in his chest while his hand remained steady against the dog's side, feeling the tight, rising rhythm beneath her ribs, a rhythm that spoke of urgency and time slipping away faster than the storm outside. "You are all right," he murmured, though the words were meant as much for himself as for her, his voice quiet, grounded, the same tone he had once used in places where calm was the only thing standing between chaos and survival. The dog's ears flicked at the sound, not fully lifting, but enough to show she was listening, that she was still present, still fighting in her own silent way. Snow gathered along her back, melting slowly against the faint warmth she still carried, and Ethan could see now how far she must have come, the faint trail behind her marked by uneven prints and a thin line where the chain had carved through the powder. He followed that line with his eyes for a moment, tracing it back between the trees until it disappeared into darkness. And something about it felt wrong, not just the chain itself, but the way it had been left behind, as if whatever had once held her had been abandoned in a hurry, unfinished, unresolved. The forest held no answers, only the soft creak of branches under the weight of ice and the distant sigh of wind slipping through pine needles. The dog shifted again, a low tremor running through her body, and Ethan recognized the change immediately, not from books or training manuals, but from something older, something instinctive that had never quite left him. "Okay," he said softly, moving closer, his knees settling into the snow as he leaned in, careful, deliberate, giving her space even as he prepared to help. "You are not alone now." She turned her head toward him again, her eyes catching what little light filtered through the storm. And for a brief second, there was something almost human in the way she looked at him. Not fear, not pain, but trust given without hesitation, as if she had already decided long before he arrived that he was the one she had been searching for. Ethan swallowed hard, the cold air sharp in his lungs, and shrugged off his outer jacket, laying it gently beneath her as a barrier against the frozen ground, his movements slow, practiced, each action measured as if the moment demanded respect. The storm seemed to close in tighter around them, the world shrinking to the space beneath the trees, to the sound of his breath and hers, to the quiet determination that held them both in place. Another tremor came, stronger this time, and Ethan steadied her with one hand, his other bracing against the snow as he adjusted his position. He had seen life begin in far harsher places, had held on to fragile moments when everything else had fallen apart, and something in him shifted now. Not fear, not doubt, but purpose returning in a way he had not felt in years. "Stay with me," he whispered, the words carried gently into the cold air, and the dog let out a soft exhale, her body easing just enough to show she understood. Above them, the wind moved through the branches again, a low whisper threading through the storm, and for a moment Ethan thought of that silence on the road, the kind that always came before something changed, something that could not be undone. He did not know yet what this night would bring, or why this dog had chosen him out of all the empty miles of frozen road. But as he stayed there beside her, grounded in the quiet urgency of the moment, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. A sense that this was not an accident, that somewhere beneath the storm and the darkness, something unseen had guided her steps, and now his as well, toward a moment that would ask more of him than he had given in years, and perhaps give something back in return. The storm did not ease, but something inside it shifted, as if the night itself had begun to listen more closely, and Ethan felt it in the way the air moved around them, quieter now, heavier, like a pause between heartbeats, while his hands remained steady, guiding, supporting, doing what needed to be done without hesitation, without panic, because there was no room for either here. The dog's breathing changed again, deeper now, strained but purposeful, and Ethan leaned closer, his voice low and calm, the kind of calm that had once steadied men in far worse places. "That is it. You are doing fine," he said, each word slow and grounded, carried just enough to reach her without breaking the fragile rhythm of the moment. Snow gathered on his shoulders, melting slowly against the heat of his body, while beneath his hands he felt the quiet miracle unfolding, small, fragile, and impossibly strong all at once. Time lost its shape out there among the trees, measured not in minutes, but in breaths, in the rise and fall of the dog's chest, in the subtle shifts of her body as she pushed through something older than fear, older than pain. And then it happened. A small movement, a new sound, soft, barely there, but real. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his hands careful, precise, as he guided the tiny life into the cold world and immediately shielded it from the snow, wrapping it gently in the edge of his jacket. "Hey there. You made it," he whispered, his voice softer now, almost a reverence, as if speaking too loudly might break the moment. The dog turned her head weakly, her eyes finding the small bundle, and something in her expression eased, a quiet recognition that what she had fought for was now here, alive, breathing. But the night was not finished. Another tremor came, stronger than before, and Ethan shifted again, his body aching from the cold and the position, but his focus never wavering. He worked through each moment with the same steady patience, the same quiet determination, until another small life followed, and then another, each one greeted not with noise, not with chaos, but with a calm that felt almost sacred in the middle of the storm. The forest seemed to hold that calm with them, the wind lowering to a distant whisper, the branches above creaking softly, as if bearing witness. And yet, not everything came easily. One of the small bodies lay too still, too quiet against the fabric, and Ethan felt a familiar weight press against his chest, the kind that came when a moment hung in the balance between what could be and what might be lost. "Come on, stay with me," he murmured, his hands gentle but firm, his movements careful, guided by instinct more than memory, because some things were not taught, they were carried. He waited. A second stretched, then another, and then, almost too faint to hear, a small breath broke through the silence. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, as if something unseen had just answered. When he opened them again, the world felt different, not warmer, not safer, but fuller, as if the space around them had been filled with something that had not been there before. The dog shifted closer to the small lives gathered beside her, her body curving protectively despite her exhaustion, and Ethan remained there with them. The storm still falling, the night still deep, but no longer empty. Somewhere beyond the trees, far from the road, far from the life he had been living, something had begun that he did not yet understand, but he could feel it settling quietly into place, like a path forming beneath fresh snow, waiting to be followed. The first hint of dawn did not come as light, but as a soft thinning of the darkness, a quiet shift in the sky above the trees where the storm began to lose its edge, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. The way the wind no longer cut as sharply, the way the snow fell straighter now, no longer driven sideways with the same relentless force. He sat back slightly on his heels, his body stiff from the cold, his hands still resting close to the small cluster of life gathered beside the dog. Each tiny movement a reminder that what had begun in the middle of the storm had not only survived, but endured. The dog lay curled protectively around them, her breathing slower now, deeper, though still fragile, her eyes half closed but never fully at rest, always returning to the small forms pressed against her for warmth. Ethan reached out carefully, adjusting the edge of his jacket around them, making sure the fabric held in as much heat as it could, his movements instinctive, deliberate, shaped by years of doing what was necessary in moments when comfort was a luxury. He glanced once more toward the dark line of trees behind them, toward the faint trail that had led him here, and something about it lingered in his mind, a quiet question that had not yet found its answer. The chain still lay half buried in the snow, its metal dulled by frost, trailing back into the forest as if pointing to a place that did not want to be remembered. Ethan studied it for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition that this night was not as simple as it first appeared. The dog had not wandered aimlessly. She had come with direction, with purpose, with the kind of determination that did not belong to chance. And now, as the storm began to loosen its grip, that purpose felt unfinished. He shifted his weight and slowly rose to his feet, the cold air pressing against him again as he stood. But something inside him had changed, something steadier, more grounded, as if the long emptiness he had carried had found something to anchor itself. 2. He looked down at the dog, meeting her gaze as her eyes opened fully now, watching him with that same quiet awareness. "I am not leaving you," he said softly, the words simple, but carrying more weight than he expected, because he knew in that moment they were not just a promise for this night, but for whatever came after. The dog blinked slowly, her head resting back against the snow, her body still curved around the small lives that depended on her, and for the first time since he had seen her on the road, there was a trace of calm in her expression, a release of something she had been holding onto for far too long. Ethan took a slow breath, the air filling his lungs with a sharp clarity, and turned his gaze once more toward the forest beyond, toward the faint, nearly erased marks in the snow, the broken line of footprints and drag that hinted at a story still hidden just out of reach. The world was waking now, not with noise, but with a quiet unfolding, the kind that came after a long night when something unseen had shifted beneath the surface. He knew he could carry her back, could bring her and the pups to warmth and safety, and he would. But as he stood there between what had already happened and what was waiting beyond the trees, he understood that this was only the beginning, that whatever had driven her into the storm had not disappeared with the night, and that somewhere out there, just beyond the fading storm, the next step of this story was already waiting for him to follow. The snow had begun to settle into a quiet stillness, soft and undisturbed except for the narrow path that had led Ethan here. And he knew they could not stay much longer, not with the cold pressing in and the fragile warmth around the small lives beginning to fade with each passing minute. He knelt again beside the dog, his movements careful, deliberate, as if any sudden shift might break the delicate balance they had fought through the night to hold together. "We are going to get you somewhere warm," he said softly, his voice steady, not asking for permission but offering certainty, the kind that came from a man who had made decisions under pressure before and learned not to hesitate when it mattered most. The dog lifted her head slightly, her eyes following him, and though her body was still weak, there was a quiet understanding in the way she watched him, as if she knew this next step would carry them beyond the storm. Ethan worked quickly but gently, gathering the small pups into the fold of his jacket, creating a pocket of warmth against his chest, his hands shielding them from the cold air as he adjusted the fabric to keep them secure. Each tiny movement beneath the cloth was a reminder of how fragile they were, how easily this night could have gone differently, and he felt a weight settle into him, not heavy, but grounding, a responsibility that felt both sudden and strangely familiar. He then slid one arm beneath the dog, lifting her carefully, mindful of her condition, supporting her weight in a way that kept her close without causing strain. She let out a soft breath, her body relaxing just enough to trust the motion, and for a moment, as he stood with her held close, Ethan felt something shift again inside him, a quiet alignment of purpose and action that had been missing for far too long. The walk back was slower than the one that had brought him here, each step measured, each movement adjusted to protect what he carried, his boots pressing deep into the snow as the trees began to thin and the faint outline of the road reappeared ahead. The storm had nearly passed now, leaving behind a world muted and still, the sky lightening into a pale gray that stretched across the horizon like a promise not yet spoken. As he reached the edge of the forest, Ethan paused for a moment, turning his head slightly as his eyes followed the faint trail that disappeared back into the trees, that broken line of marks and metal that hinted at something unfinished, something waiting beyond what he could see. He held that thought for only a second before shifting his focus back to the dog and the small lives pressed against him, because whatever answers lay out there could wait, but this could not. The truck came into view, its surface dusted with snow, standing alone on the empty road like it had been left behind by time itself, and Ethan moved toward it with renewed purpose, opening the passenger door and carefully settling the dog onto the seat, arranging his jacket around her and the pups to keep the warmth contained. He closed the door gently, the sound soft against the quiet morning, and stood there for a moment, his hand resting against the cold metal as he looked through the glass. The dog's eyes were half closed again, but they opened briefly when she sensed him, meeting his gaze with that same steady awareness, and Ethan gave a small nod, not to reassure her, but to acknowledge what had passed between them. He walked around to the driver's side, the crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound in the still air, and as he started the engine, the low rumble filled the space with a sense of movement returning, of something beginning to unfold. The heater coughed to life slowly, pushing out faint warmth, and Ethan pulled onto the road, the tires carving a new path through the snow. Ahead of him lay the town, the clinic, the answers he could reach, but behind him, hidden among the trees, something remained, something that had set all of this in motion. And as he drove forward, Ethan knew with quiet certainty that this was not a story that ended with rescue, but one that had only just begun to reveal what it had been leading him toward all along. The road stretched ahead in a pale ribbon of ice and snow, the truck moving steadily now as the storm faded into a distant memory behind them, and inside the cab the air slowly warmed, carrying with it the quiet sound of small, fragile breaths that filled the space with something Ethan had not realized he had been missing. He kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly against the edge of his jacket where the pups were nestled, feeling their faint movements, each one a reminder that what had begun in the forest was still unfolding, still asking something of him. Beside him, the dog lay curled against the seat, her breathing more even now, her body no longer trembling with the same urgency, though every so often her ears would flick, as if she were still listening to something far beyond the reach of human hearing. Ethan noticed it more than once, the way her head would shift slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the passing trees and the fading line of the forest they had left behind. It was not fear. It was awareness, the kind that did not let go easily. He followed her gaze briefly, his eyes scanning the edge of the woods as they drove, and for a moment he thought he saw something in the distance. Not movement exactly, but a break in the pattern of the trees, something out of place that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. He did not slow down. Not yet. The town came into view gradually, a scattering of buildings half buried in snow, the early morning light catching on rooftops and frozen fences, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing unusual stayed hidden for long. Ethan pulled into the small veterinary clinic at the edge of town, the sign creaking softly in the wind, and cut the engine. The sudden silence inside the truck felt heavier than the storm had been, as if the world were waiting to see what he would do next. He stepped out, the cold air biting again, but now it felt different, less like an enemy and more like something he could move through. Carefully, he opened the passenger door and lifted the dog once more, keeping her close as he gathered the pups against his chest, his movements instinctive, practiced, as if he had been doing this all his life. The clinic door opened before he reached it. A woman stood there, her hair pulled back, her expression sharp at first, then softening instantly as she took in the scene before her. "Bring her in," she said, her voice calm, steady, the kind that did not waste time on questions when action mattered more. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them immediately, a stark contrast to the world outside, and Ethan felt his shoulders lower slightly as he carried the dog to the examination table. The woman moved with quiet efficiency, checking, assessing, guiding without urgency, but without delay, her hands gentle as they worked. "She is strong," she said after a moment, glancing up at Ethan, "and so are these little ones." Ethan nodded once, not trusting himself to say more, his eyes resting on the dog as she lay there, calmer now, her gaze drifting between him and the small lives beside her. For a brief moment, everything seemed to settle into place, the storm behind them, the warmth around them, the quiet assurance that they had made it through the night. But then the dog's ears lifted again, sharper this time, her head turning toward the door, her body tensing just slightly despite her exhaustion. Ethan noticed it immediately. That same signal, that same awareness. He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the frosted glass of the clinic entrance. Outside, beyond the blur of condensation and morning light, a shape moved past the window, slow, deliberate, and then gone. The room fell into a different kind of silence, not empty, but waiting, and Ethan felt it again, that quiet pull, that sense that whatever had started in the forest had not ended with their arrival here, but had followed them, step by step, into the light. The room held its warmth, but the air had changed, subtle and quiet, like the moment before a memory returns, and Ethan felt it settle into his chest as he stood near the table, his attention no longer only on the dog and her pups, but on the space beyond the glass where something had passed without sound. The veterinarian continued her work with steady hands, adjusting blankets, checking each small life with practiced care, but even she seemed to sense the shift, her movements slowing just slightly as she glanced toward the door. "You expecting someone?" she asked, her voice low, not alarmed, just curious, but Ethan shook his head, his eyes still fixed on the faint outline of the entrance. "No," he said quietly, though the word felt uncertain the moment it left him, because something about this did not feel random, did not feel like coincidence. The dog stirred again, her head lifting higher now despite her exhaustion, her ears pointed forward, her body alert in a way that spoke not of fear, but of recognition, as if whatever had been outside was not entirely unknown to her. Ethan stepped closer to her, his hand resting gently along her neck, feeling the tension beneath her fur, the quiet readiness that had not left her since. "The forest. It is all right," he murmured, though his gaze remained on the door, waiting, listening, the way he had learned to do long ago when silence carried more information than noise ever could. For a moment, nothing happened. The clinic remained still, the only sounds the soft hum of the heater and the faint movements of the pups beneath the blankets. Then the handle on the door shifted, just slightly, not enough to open, but enough to catch Ethan's attention completely. He straightened, his posture changing almost without thought, his senses narrowing to the small details that others might miss. The door did not open. The handle returned to stillness. And yet, the feeling remained. Someone had been there. Someone had paused. Watching. The veterinarian set down a small cloth and looked toward Ethan again, her expression more focused now. "Do you want me to call someone?" she asked, but Ethan shook his head once more, slower this time, more certain, though not because he understood what was happening, but because something inside him told him this was not a moment to hand off to anyone else. "No," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "Not yet." The dog let out a soft breath, her body easing slightly, but her eyes remained fixed on the door, following something Ethan could not see. And then, just as slowly as the tension had come, it began to fade, leaving behind only the quiet warmth of the room and the steady rhythm of life continuing on the table. Ethan exhaled, though the weight in his chest did not fully lift. He stepped closer to the window, wiping a small patch of condensation away with the edge of his sleeve, and looked out into the pale morning. The street lay empty, the snow undisturbed except for the tracks of his own truck, the building still and silent as the town slowly woke. No figure, no movement, nothing that explained what he had felt. And yet, as he stood there, his eyes scanning the edges of the road, the line of trees beyond the clinic, he noticed something small, almost invisible against the snow. A set of footprints, faint, partially covered by the night storm, but there, leading toward the clinic, and then stopping, not turning, not continuing, just stopping, as if whoever had made them had chosen not to come any closer. Ethan stared at them for a long moment, his mind tracing the line back, connecting it to the trail in the forest, to the chain, to the dog that had walked out of the storm and into his path with purpose. Behind him, the dog shifted once more, a soft sound leaving her as she settled beside her pups, and Ethan turned back to her, meeting her gaze again. There was something unspoken there, something waiting, and he understood it now in a way he had not before. This was not over. Whatever had been left behind in the storm had followed them into the light, and it was not finished telling its story. The footprints did not leave Ethan's mind, even as the room settled back into its quiet rhythm, because there was something deliberate about the way they ended, something that spoke of a decision rather than chance, and he found himself replaying the image again and again, the faint impressions in the snow, the way they had approached, and then stopped just short of the door, as if whoever made them had come close enough to see, but not close enough to be seen. He stepped away from the window slowly, his gaze drifting back to the dog and her pups, grounding himself in what was certain, in the steady rise and fall of their breathing, in the warmth that now surrounded them. The veterinarian moved quietly beside the table, adjusting a small lamp, her expression thoughtful as she glanced toward Ethan. "She will need rest," she said gently, her voice carrying a calm assurance. "But she is stronger than she looks." Ethan nodded, though his attention lingered elsewhere, divided between the present and something just beyond it, something still waiting to be understood. The dog shifted again, her ears lifting slightly as her eyes met his, and there was a clarity there now, a quiet strength that had not been as visible before, as if the night had taken something from her, but also given something back. Ethan stepped closer, resting his hand lightly against her side, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away, the questions, the uncertainty, leaving only the connection that had brought them together in the first place. "You did not just survive," he murmured under his breath, more to himself than to her. "You led the way." The words settled between them, simple but true, and the dog blinked slowly, her gaze steady, as if acknowledging something he had only just begun to understand. Outside, the light had grown stronger, casting long pale shadows across the snow, and the town had begun to stir, faint sounds of life returning to the streets, distant engines, a door opening somewhere down the block, small signs that the world was moving forward as it always did. But for Ethan, time still felt suspended, caught between what had happened and what it meant. He moved back toward the window once more, his eyes searching the ground where the footprints had been, but already they were fading, softened by the morning light and the shifting air, as if the evidence itself did not wish to remain. He studied the edges carefully, noticing now that the impressions were uneven, not in a way that suggested weakness, but in a way that suggested hesitation, pauses between steps, moments where the path had nearly turned away before continuing forward again. Whoever had walked there had not been certain. They had come anyway. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind piecing together what little he had. The chain in the forest, the trail that led nowhere, the presence outside the clinic that chose not to enter, and beneath it all, the dog who had walked through the storm not just to survive, but to arrive. Behind him, the veterinarian spoke again, softer this time. "Animals remember things we do not always see," she said, almost as if she were speaking to the room itself. "Sometimes they carry pieces of a story until someone is ready to understand it." Ethan turned slightly at that, the words settling deeper than he expected, and he glanced back at the dog, at the quiet way she rested now, surrounded by the small lives she had protected with everything she had. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, because something about this did feel like a story, one that had begun long before he stepped onto that road, one that had chosen its moment. Carefully, and as he stood there between the fading footprints and the steady warmth of the room, Ethan realized that the answers he was looking for were not entirely behind him, buried in the storm, but still moving, still unfolding, waiting somewhere just ahead, where the next step would have to be taken not by chance, but by choice. The day moved forward slowly, but something within it remained suspended, like a thread pulled tight between what had already happened and what had yet to reveal itself, and Ethan felt that tension even as the clinic settled into a calm rhythm, the quiet work of healing continuing around him. The veterinarian had finished her checks, her movements now softer, less urgent, and the dog rested with a steady breath, her body no longer burdened by the strain of the night. The small pups gathered close, their faint sounds blending into a gentle, living silence. Ethan stood nearby, his hands resting loosely at his sides, but his attention was far from still, drawn again and again to the space beyond the window, to the place where the footprints had been, now nearly erased by the slow shift of the morning. He stepped outside without fully deciding to, the door closing quietly behind him as the cold air met him once more, sharper now in the light, but no longer unforgiving. The snow stretched out in every direction, untouched except for the fading marks that had first caught his eye, and he walked toward them with measured steps, his boots pressing fresh impressions into the surface as he approached the place where the trail ended. Up close, the details became clearer, not in form, but in feeling, the uneven spacing, the slight turns of the prints, the way they angled toward the clinic and then hesitated, as if the path itself had paused to consider whether to continue. Ethan crouched slightly, his gaze following the line backward, tracing it toward the distant edge of town where the trees began again, where the storm had held its ground through the night. He remained there for a long moment, the quiet settling around him, the kind of quiet that did not demand answers, only attention. Behind him, the clinic door opened softly, and the veterinarian stepped out, her coat pulled tight against the cold, her eyes moving from Ethan to the faint trail in the snow. "You see it too," she said, not as a question, but as a simple acknowledgement. Ethan nodded once, his expression thoughtful, not troubled, but aware. "They came close," he replied, his voice low, steady. "Close enough to know she made it." The veterinarian followed his gaze, then looked back toward the door, toward the warmth inside where the dog and her pups rested. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "people do not come all the way in, not because they cannot, but because something in them is not ready to be seen." Ethan let those words settle, feeling their weight in a way that was not entirely about the moment, but about something deeper, something that reached back further than this morning. He stood again, his eyes lifting toward the line of trees beyond the town, the place where the trail would eventually lead if followed long enough. And he understood now that this was not simply about what had been left behind, but about what still remained to be found. He turned back toward the clinic, toward the warmth, toward the life that had begun under his hands in the middle of a storm, and as he reached for the door, he paused just briefly, glancing once more at the fading prints in the snow. They were almost gone now, softened into the surface, their edges blurred by time and light, but the direction they pointed still remained, clear in a way that did not rely on sight alone. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him, the warmth wrapping around him once more, and as he moved back toward the dog and her pups, he felt a quiet certainty settle into place. This was not an ending. It was an invitation. Not to chase what had disappeared, but to follow what had been revealed. And somewhere beyond the town, beyond the place where the storm had broken, the rest of the story was still waiting, not hidden, not lost, but simply unfinished, ready for the moment when someone would choose to step forward and continue it.